So when we're looking at flagstone tessellations, we might think that they all need to be exactly twist-based. Most of them are, but there are some that are a little bit sneakier that have these Isoarea square twists where part of it is going underneath, part of it is above, and there's multiple ways of framing how to make that happen. So I actually have 3 different ways of approaching that with different styles of gridding. And then we're going to do the easy way with a 32-fold square grid with single diagonals to fold a piece together. So first off, you could think of it as, oh, I have a square grid and I'm going to put in the diagonals to get these closed Isoarea square twists. So it's these little square structures in the middle here where two of the folds around the square are mountains and the other 2 are valleys. And you can see this ridge line here that actually goes flat in the end. And you can see the other squares have that as a valley, and you can arbitrarily switch it back and forth between valley and, if it'll go back, mountain in between there. What matters is that you have some diagonal that's letting you hinge this open and closed. So the second way of thinking about it is to say, okay, well, what if I have that little square as a grid square and have whatever shapes I want for my flagstone shapes be the diagonals. You can do that too. But what I'm going to teach you today is you can have all of these things on grid lines by using a 45-degree grid. So we're going to fold this pattern with the small and the large squares on here. And I will say that one of the cool things about this style is that sometimes you get flagstones on both sides. So when you don't have these extra large squares that lead to gaps in the middle, you end up with these structures. This one's actually the same on both sides. You can see the line of squares and then the line of rectangles. And it's a really flexible way to be working on tessellations. Also, good morning, Nancy. So this one also does have gaps on the back. It will create these nice rectangles. So that'll be fun too. So the rectangles are shapes that you don't see again until really advanced tessellations. So getting them here and now is kind of a treat. So I'm going to start out by locating the center of my paper. And I'm doing that by following the diagonals out to the corner. But on a grid this size, I can kind of eyeball it and say, okay, hey, it needs to be this grid intersection with the diagonals running through it because this is a grid with diagonals through the center. You can do the opposite choice, which actually is why I have this grid on Taunt instead of Skytone, because I folded this for a class that I was teaching and then realized, oh wait, I need the diagonals to not go through the center. So I've got my center, and what I'm going to do, so particularly when you're starting to learn something, you want to draw out everything that you're doing. I'm going to draw this square, it's mountain folds, and I'm going to give it diagonal legs. Then what I'm going to do is match a diagonal and draw a corner. So I've matched across this boundary, or across this intersection without diagonals. And I'm going to go ahead and draw that on all four of these legs off of the central square. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in with my valley fold color, blue, and I'm going to close these little squares. So we've got the mountains on two sides, valleys on two sides, and I'm going to draw in some more of these corners. And notice I've kept the same rule at every corner. I've got two folds coming in at a 90-degree angle, and then the diagonal going off, two coming in at 90 degrees, diagonal going out, and the diagonal is only ever going to go one spacing because it's hitting these Isoarea structures. So the diagonal, you could think of it as a pleat of a twist, or you can think of it as the center of the next twist. It's kind of trippy. You could think of your pleats either as going horizontal and vertical, or as going diagonal. And then when we go to fold, so this is the general structure that we're going to be using the whole time. When we go to fold, what I'm going to do is not do all of it at once. I'm going to pick one corner. I'm going to do the upper right corner of my central square. And I'm going to focus on just that one Isoarea square twist. So I'm running my mountains horizontally left all the way to the edge of the paper, and vertically down all the way to the edge of the paper. And these aren't just mountains, they come with valleys next to them. And notice I've left that diagonal popping down. So then on the opposite side of the Isoarea square, I have another corner with mountains. I'm going to bring up that corner as well, and this time the pleats will go horizontally to the right, like so, and vertically to the top. And you may need to start bringing everything in together to get this moving. So with this corner in place, I can go ahead and swivel around. You can see that I've got a little valley as a temporary fold in the middle. And I'm going to get that down and into place and smooth it out. I'm going to make sure to use my bone folder on all of my pleats so they're more firmly in place. Then I'm going to move on to another corner. I'm going to go ahead and do the one to the bottom right. I'm going to rotate a quarter turn so it looks exactly the same as the one we just did. And what I'm going to do here is set up the corner on the central square first. So this is going to create a tube down to the bottom of the paper. and then I'll set up the corner on the outer side of the paper. And once everything is set up, it wants to slide and squash down into place. So this technique is very flexible. You can create a wide variety of tessellations, and you can even change your mind as you're folding. So next up, I want to do this corner, and here I've got a little bit of a conundrum. Do I want to get both of these corners at the same time, or do I want to have a pleat overlap that I then open later? And for these tessellations, it's going to be really difficult to open a pleat overlap. So I'm going to recommend doing these at the same time. So notice I got my top corner set up. I let that diagonal dive down into the horizontal valley. And I'm not running my vertical pleat all the way down. Instead, I opened it up and I let that diagonal dive down so I can lift up the paper neighboring it. And I start emphasizing all of my pleats leading to the outside. And I can get all 4 of these corners set up. And again, I'll use my bone folder to reinforce each of these folds. And I'm not worried about how I'm rotating the paper while I'm reinforcing things, because all 4 sides are exactly the same. So from here, we really have choices about what squares we're going to define next. What I'm going to do is draw the outlines, or at least the outer outlines, of our next squares. And one thing to pay attention to here is, because we need a diagonal coming out of each corner has to be a grid intersection with diagonals. I couldn't put the corner here. I could put it here, but I can't put it there. And so, I may as well draw that on each of them. And so I'm coming around and drawing my next layer out. Okay, so now that I've got all 4 of those drawn on, it's time to do some more folding. And what I'm going to do, the way I'm going to approach this, is I'm going to take a tube pleat. So these 2 pleats that are folding in towards each other. And basically this is what I do with all of my tessellations. I take a set of parallel pleats and I work on those, and I make sure I have no pleat overlaps before I move to the next set of parallel pleats. And so what I'm going to do here, and there is a rule that I can remember that helps me in the folding, and that's that each of these squares has 4-fold rotational symmetry in its center. So whatever I did on this corner of this square, I also need to do in the same way on this corner. So I can't have them coming in towards each other, they need to go out around, which is the opposite of what was true in this tessellation. In this one, each square is centered on a position of 2-fold rotational symmetry. So that's just a rule that the tessellation follows, and I'm going to emphasize my diagonal coming out of this corner, And because we see this little square here, that's going to need to be this square over here. So when I start setting this up, I can see that I'm going to create something new in this direction. So that was a little bit fast. Let me do it again slower. So I'm making sure that this mountain dives down one spacing away from the corner of the square. And then I identified where my Isoarea square is. And I think I forgot to define Isoarea means same on both sides. And so the opposite corner of the Isoarea square needs to be lifted and given a right angle. And we can see that this is mostly happy, like this upper portion is happy to fold flat, but this bottom portion is not. And so what I'm going to do is bring up the little diagonal off the corner of this lower square, and this is on the top side of the lower square. So our Isoarea square is going to be sitting here on top, and I can find that opposite diagonal of the Isoarea square, which is leading back up into here and causing our new little square repeat. So the other way I could do that is say that I know I'm going to be alternating between little squares and big squares, so this one has to be a little square, and that will shut off there. And I'm going to go in with my bone folder and make sure those two new Isoarea square twists are smoothed into place. So you can see this kind of wants to puff up. These kinds of tessellations really benefit from heavy flattening. And then I'm done with that set of parallel plates, and it's time to rotate around to the next set of parallel plates. And now I have 3 of them. I'm going to start with this one at the top. One of the things with this kind of folding is that you will end up needing to complete all of the sets of parallel plates before the edge will really lay flat if you're not doing pleat overlaps. And so starting at the top, my diagonal points out, and I can see that my Isoarea square is going to need to sit at the top to match these two. So my diagonal opposite the mountain I just put in is over this way, and then we come out with the horizontal and vertical pleats. And so one thing we can do is run this all the way down, creating pleat overlaps to flatten this upper portion. And then we're immediately going to open the pleat overlap to find our new diagonal. Again, the diagonal needs to pop down into a valley, and the Isoarea square on this edge is going to be on the right instead of on the bottom. And so we can pop up our new small square. And since we knew that that was a small square, I went ahead and had the diagonal come down in here and the horizontal pleats both in place. So this already puts the pressure in place for our new diagonal to tuck under and our pleat to go down to the bottom. And then we bring everything in and squash. So with that in place, we're going to rotate to the next set of parallel pleats and repeat that process exactly. So on this corner of the big square, the Isoarea twist is going to be on the top. So we can set that up. And by the way, this is probably why I'm so effective at like pushing little bits down to make everything else do what I want. I did quite a few of these tessellations before I went fully twist-based. And then down here, we need to open this enough to get that diagonal running down. And on this side, remember the rotational symmetry, the Isoarea twist is going to be on the right. And so I can bring up my small square, and I'm already emphasizing that bottom corner and the diagonal running under. So I can emphasize, get that diagonal fully emphasized. So I can then emphasize this diagonal off of the big square. And bring everything in together. And I will also say this is a good use case for clips because those other sets of parallel pleats are wanting to come undone while I'm folding. So definitely recommend drawing on your paper and using clips when you start out. So speaking of drawing on the paper, I'm going to draw the boundaries of these small squares and then rotate to the next set of parallel pleats. We're coming around, this is the fourth set of parallel pleats around, so we have a slight difference at the bottom. And I'll start from the top. And I'll do this a little bit faster because y'all do have the recording. And so I'm emphasizing where things need to go, which helps me emphasize the next place that they need to go. And I'm going to leave this as an overlap and down at the bottom for right now. So I just did the speed run of the parts that we've already seen twice. I would say 3 times, but the top pleat was not present the first time around. And now here we're going to effectively make up for the fact that the top pleat wasn't present the first time and set up our new corner, and we're making sure that we're never bringing 2 bits together on the same side. So had to be over here. And one of the really cool things about this style of folding is you can arbitrarily add space. And actually that's true of the twist-based style as well. It's just more obvious here that, okay, I could choose to put the corner of the next bit here, and that's going to cause a certain cascade of effects. Or I could choose to put it further out, but I need to make the same choice for all 3 of these. So that's some of the flexibility at play in these tessellations. So I've drawn on the boundaries for my next set of small squares, and it's really arbitrary what set of parallel pleats to start on, but we just did these, so I'm going to keep the pattern and rotate and work in a spiral around. So from here, I'm going to have this pleat, and I can't bring it in this way, so I need to have the other corner out here. And for this one, so I know this is headed into a large square, so I can go ahead and make that diagonal emphasized underneath. So I can tuck the diagonal from the next square under while I make this horizontal pleat. And that's going to set me up to repeat these steps exactly down below. So setting up that isoarea twist for the big square, and then setting the diagonal for the big square so I can do the diagonal for the small square underneath. And so on the one hand, this tessellation is using Isoarea closed square twist. That's an advanced twist, right? But on the other hand, we're adding no new folds to the grid. This is entirely grid-based when we use the diagonals. So what level of difficulty is this tessellation? Well, it really depends how much gridding you do. If you don't do the gridding, then the diagonals in the grid, you're going to need to pre-crease. You're going to need to have a more difficult collapse. It's just not going to be nearly as fun. But here, we're just manipulating our little pleats, and things are popping out how we want them. And we're just doing some grid manipulations to get what we want. And so I had an extra pleat at the top. That Isoarea square is going to be on top of that small square. And then emphasizing this diagonal. And notice how I'm using my fingers on both sides of the paper to make these things pop into place. And here our Isoarea square needs to be to the right, so I'm going to pop up that side of it and then emphasize my diagonal going down and left, so my new diagonal can go up and right. And effectively, I'm working through this tessellation, kind of one pleat at a time, but mostly doing whole edges at a stretch. So then I rotate and I repeat, getting this top piece, and then coming down here to get my other big square and pop that down, make sure that diagonal is good underneath. And I want to get things to a state where I can kind of get things close to collapsing, but I'm going to leave it slightly up because it's just going to puff up anyways when I do the next repeat. And so I'm manipulating this. I am using my fingers from the back side for a lot of these folds and getting that new twist in, or I mean, depending on how you count things, like you can't even hardly tell which ones are twists and which ones are pleats in this arrangement of squares, or in this style in general. As I mentioned earlier, you can give a more definitive answer if you use a regular square grid without diagonals. This one is saying that the Isoarea twist is the twist. This one is saying that the big squares are twists. But it's really kind of arbitrary which one you choose. And then rotating around, we have our fourth and final edge for this round. And really, this entire tessellation can be decomposed into two skills. You have a closed square, or sorry, that's treating these as twists. You have a small square, and you're adding a bigger one. Or you have a big square, and you're adding a smaller one. And you're doing these moves in exactly the same way. It just looks different while you're doing them. And so really the only thing that I'm doing here is putting in these Isoarea closed square twists, and the rest is really a matter of how I'm spacing them. That's everything that's going on. All these closed Isoarea square twists that, if you have the diagonals in your grid, are actually really easy to put in. So we're getting close to the edge of the paper. I'm gonna be going around and adding a bit more. And you can see this, it's only been 30 minutes. This is really fast for a flagstone tessellation. So the time investment in this style is in the grid, not the twists. And we get to see a little bit of what's going to happen at the edges. At this point, each corner is independent, and so I can go ahead and finish up this corner while I'm here. And I'm using those Isoarea closed square twists to help me find exactly what goes where. So finishing that corner really came down to finishing this smaller square, and it was just a little bit going on there, and there's not enough paper to finish out that edge. Then coming on down, and I will say that if I wanted to, I could make these big squares that I'm going to put in all little rectangles. There's a lot of flexibility in the pattern. You can make stuff smaller as well as larger. there's really endless possibilities. And so this is the same exact move that I've been doing all along. It's just right on the edge, and so you might run into some difficulties because with it being on the edge, you have to know with more certainty exactly what you're doing. You can't just let the paper handle that for you. Which can be a good thing for learning. And repeating again. So I hadn't done this style of folding for probably several years now. I mean, with the exception of making the one of the little demos. So this is kind of coming back to an old friend for me, where I had forgotten how straightforward this was to fold. It's actually not that bad to do and pretty nice for a beginning folder. And then rotating for the fourth exact replica of the same thing. And I say exact replica, but often you get the paper fighting you in different ways on different sides. And in a moment, we'll have the big reveal of what this looks like on the back. Okay, so that was a Flagstone tessellation in under 40 minutes, not counting the gridding, of course. And when we flip it over, we see this lovely pattern of these rectangular blocks. And you might be thinking, oh, hey, that looks a lot like an Elan Garibi pattern. And that is correct, because what you can also do with these is shrink these blocks in one spacing from each side, like let the diagonal continue in towards the center. And you can get a 3D structure that forms these lovely blocks. If I remember correctly, this is Elan's Twister C, but he wouldn't do as much gridding for it, but he'd pay for it with pre-creasing. And so you can get that 3D effect with this style too. And yeah, it's definitely very cool to flip over and see what all these different patterns produce on the back side, and definitely one to practice to to really master the techniques. And I mean, as I said before, this is really, really versatile. And so you can think of this as having lines of twists in two directions. And so what's going on with this one is it's saying, okay, minimum plus one, minimum plus one, minimum plus one for the spacing of these squares, because this 2x2 grid square is the minimum. Otherwise, you're going to run into, well, nothing, because you're going to have everything around a single point and it's just not going to work. And you have to count in increments of 2 because you need the corners of the squares to be at intersections with diagonals. So we've got effectively 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, and in the other direction also 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1. And so in something like this, the calculation is a little bit different, where it's saying in one direction 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, and in the other direction 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1. And so you can play with these lines and add space between things and just do a bunch of crazy different ways of looking at this. And that's one of the things I'm going to talk about more in a future video. So that's going to be all for today. And I hope y'all have fun folding this. And I want you to see if you can figure out some more variations of your own. And particularly see if you can replicate this one that's the same on both sides. So happy folding, everyone, and I will see you next week when we'll talk about flagstone equilateral triangles. See you there.